Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The news from the Syrian civil war is fog of war. There are reports that the Russians have launched airstrikes against a part of Syria that is not associated with the Islamic State. There are reports that the Russians have told the Americans to no longer fly airstrikes over Syria as the Russians are operating against the Islamic State or not. There are reports that there is a breakdown in mill-to-mill conversation between Moscow and Washington. That is the Syrian conflict. However, we move tonight to another conflict zone. This is Eastern Asia, chiefly the People's Republic, because surprisingly, when you look at your map, you wouldn't think that the PLA Navy operating off the shores of China would get involved in the Syrian civil war, which is the shores of the Mediterranean. But there you have it, a report in the Hindu. This is the Indian paper in between us, and the Indian Ocean needs to be traversed if this is to be true, saying that a Chinese naval vessel is on its way to Syria with dozens of military advisors on board. The ship is said to have passed the Suez Canal and is making its way to the Mediterranean Sea, perhaps to operate in the region of the Israeli Navy, the Cretan Navy, the Greek Navy, and the Black Sea Fleet. Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributor, joins me. Gordon, the Chinese, self-interest is everything, but we saw Xi Jinping speak of anti-terrorism operations by the PLA when he was in Washington and again when he was in New York. Is this PR, or is he looking to change directions?
I think Xi Jinping certainly would like the United States and other nations to help him deal with Uyghurs in what he calls Xinjiang and what the Uyghurs call the East Turkestan Republic. That's the northwestern part of China. This is an ongoing conflict which is getting worse, and we are seeing the breakdown of social order across China, including the 17 near-simultaneous explosions yesterday in Guizhou. So this is a province in the southwest of China. This is a serious situation for Beijing.
And the Chinese naval vessel in Mediterranean, that doesn't have anything to do with East Turkestan.
No, it doesn't. And, you know, this sounds inconceivable about the Chinese operating with the Russians in Syria. But we got to remember that at the height of the Syrian civil war in 2013, Chinese and Russian vessels were operating together in a coordinated fashion in the Eastern Mediterranean to scare off the United States and NATO vessels, which were in close proximity.
We welcome our colleague Harry Kazianis, the executive editor of National Interest. And he's also a senior fellow for defense policy at the Center for the National Interest. Immediately to the puzzle here, Harry, I understand there are a lot of chairs being pulled out and people having, what you'd have to say, spontaneous conversations in Washington these last hours since confirmation of the Russian airstrikes. But I want to concentrate on the PLA Navy. What's in it for them to operate in the area of the Black Sea Fleet? Good evening to you, Harry.
Good evening, gentlemen. Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I have seen earlier reports this week that have speculated that the Chinese could actually be sending the Liaoning, their only aircraft carrier that they refurbished years back and are now testing and deploying in Asia, and actually deploying it to Syria. Now, those reports have pretty much been refuted. That would actually be a tall task for the Chinese at this point, being that that is their only aircraft carrier, their biggest piece of power projection. But if they are sending a single naval asset, they certainly can do that. And as Gordon basically alluded to, the Russians and Chinese do naval operations together. They've trained together quite a bit. So that wouldn't be out of the ordinary. But I highly doubt that the Chinese are going to get extremely heavily involved in Syria. And I look at it from this perspective. Let's suppose, you know, the Chinese pull this vessel into Syria and they deployed some sort of military advisors, whether it's just to observe or, I don't know, do some sort of peacekeeping operation. Even that's sort of hard for me to observe. But let's think that through for a minute. Suppose a Chinese soldier is captured by ISIS. Do the Chinese really want to get involved in that type of situation? I mean, I think it's very clear the Chinese have very deep interests in the Middle East, but those interests are in places like Saudi Arabia, where there's huge interest in oil and natural resources coming into China. I just don't see why they would get involved in such a tinderbox. I mean, would they want to support their friends and comrades, the Russians? Maybe to a certain extent, but I just can't see it happening, to be honest with you.
So, Harry, essentially, we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years a real coordination between the foreign policies of both Moscow and Beijing. And these two countries have gotten closer together than most anybody has thought. Do you think that essentially in Syria, we are seeing a bridge too far for Beijing as they contemplate what the Russians want? Obviously, the Russians want them there. They probably don't want to be there for the reasons you point out. Is this the high water mark of cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese?
I think that's very, very possible, Gordon. I just can't see the Chinese taking such risks to back the Russians. I mean, the Russians obviously have a lot of equipment and some troops and some advanced aircraft
and a first-rate fleet, fleet operating in the littoral.
Absolutely,
yes.
But I just can't see the Chinese wanting to put themselves out and over something like this. We have to keep in mind, the Chinese are still building up their blue water capabilities. The Chinese do not have the power projection capabilities the United States has, or even the Russians, to be honest with you. So why would they want to get involved in something like this when their main foreign policy objectives is, quite frankly, to try and kick the United States out of Asia and develop all those anti-access technologies and missiles and other things? So I don't see them really taking on such a commitment like this. Maybe a token commitment to sort of back their Russian friends, but nothing serious where they're going to stick their neck out.
Harry, it's interesting when you talked about this, about the extent of China's ambitions. There have been numerous reports that the North Koreans have been helping the Assad regime. And
they built a reactor for them that was blown up by the Israelis in 2007.
That's for sure. The reactor that the Israelis got rid of, that was North Korean design, and North Korean technicians, in all probability, were killed in that raid. But there have been reports over the last couple of years of North Korean soldiers who have been advisors to the Syrian government and actually have helped deploy chemical weapons. So, it seems to me that if the Chinese are going to get involved in Syria, they're not going to do it themselves. They're going to do it through their proxies, because this has already been history.
I want to step back, gentlemen. I want to step back. We're looking at major instability. Our speculation goes to the heart of that. We don't have a map, Harry. We don't know why there's a Chinese vessel there. Perhaps they're in for a short term, perhaps for the long term. But if we look at the scale of power projection, the Russians and the Chinese are operating with some ambition that has to be across the Middle East. They're talking to Tehran, they're talking to Cairo, they're talking to Jerusalem, they're talking to Amman, they're talking to Riyadh. All those capitals now used to be on a short leash with the United States of America. And Harry, that's no longer the case.
Oh, no, I definitely agree with you there. I mean, there's no doubt the Chinese want to be players in the Middle East and maybe even Syria to some extent. But I think the Chinese are always thinking the long game, and the long game, their interests are more predominantly than Asia than anywhere else. So I think the Chinese might be there in an observing role. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of military technology that's being used out there, so why not get a front row seat about, different technologies the United States and Russia and all these other countries are using. So from an intelligence perspective, it's a gold mine. I mean, you can see how they're deploying their operations and those type of things. But are the Chinese really going to put their necks out for the Russians and really get seriously involved? I really...
1 minute, Gordon, 1 minute.
So, Harry, are we going to see Russia versus the United States in the skies over Syria, something sort of like the Cuban Missile Crisis, except a few thousand miles east?
Now that's the scary part. I think you hit the nail on the head, Gordon. I mean, with the Russians operating in Syria, bombing targets, attacking different things, there's a real danger that...
Harry, they have Sukhoi 30s. They're not for air-ground fighting. They're for air-to-air. They're interceptors.
Absolutely. So really what needs to happen at this point is the United States needs to be very clear with Vladimir Putin and find out what his exact intentions are. I mean, we know
what they are. Harry, we don't have to guess about that.
Yes, Harry, it ain't the Cuban Missile Crisis yet. Can we agree?
Absolutely, and we need to sure as heck make sure it does not get there. I don't think anybody wants to see a nuclear war over Syria.
Harry Kazianis of the National Interest, Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributor. I'm John Batchelor.